Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's Job Train How Talent session. I'm just laughing because Mo and I have been chatting in the background, and just when you got carried away chatting before we came on and almost late going live. Welcome to you all on this, hopefully, certainly is here, beautiful sunny morning. And before we get started, and also just want to allow people to join us as well, can I just check that everybody can hear and see me okay?
Well, I can.
Nice one. Thanks, Alex. Straight out of the gates. Brilliant. I'm glad to hear that it's sunny in Glasgow, Neil, for a change. This is great. Thanks, Maddie. Thanks, Lana. Thanks, Mandy. Thanks, Claire. Brilliant. Excellent. We can get started. We should also be live on LinkedIn as well as Crowdcast. So good morning to everybody that's joining us on LinkedIn this morning. This session will probably be about an hour, maybe a little bit less. It depends on how much Mo chats and also how many questions we get. But this session is very much for everybody joining us here this morning. So please feel free to ask any questions at all you might want. And also, we are running a poll as well. So if you're in Crowdcast, you can respond to that. It's on the right-hand side of the chat, and you'll see a little bit called poll. So just click on that. We'd love to know and get your feedback about if you measure or even know what your leaver NPS or Net Promoter Score is. Something that we'll be covering during the course of this session. And in terms of what we're going to be covering, the title of the session is Decoding Employee Motivations. So why people join your organization, why they stay, but also really importantly, why they leave as well. So we normally talk about recruitment on these sessions, and I'm quite glad we're making a little bit of a departure from that. The more forward-thinking organizations, in my view anyway, are now starting to look at talent far more holistically in terms of the entire life cycle, not just recruitment, but then joining that up into employee experience and things. So last time out with Gary, we looked at Job Train's candidate insight report. So looking at a lot of data around candidate motivations, about why they're seeking work, what their expectations are of employers, what their expectations are in terms of the candidate experience, a whole raft of different data points and measurements and all the rest of it. So it seemed like a really natural step to then look at the employee experience. That's exactly what we're going to be doing this morning. So with that, I'm really, really happy that Maureen Brown, or something called Mo, has joined us. Mo, would you like to give everybody an introduction to yourself? Because you'll do a far better job than I will.
It might be long. So I'm Mo Brown, Maureen, if you're looking for me on LinkedIn. I wear two hats, actually. I'm the chief executive and co-founder of MySay, a business that specializes in employee research, predominantly new starter and leaver interviews, but we also do stay interviews, focus groups, that kind of thing. So, and it's with that hat on that I'm here today, but I also am the managing director of a HR recruitment business called Sullivan Brown. So I've actually started my career in the world of recruitment, and I've been in that world for 27 years. So for me, MySay, it grew out of Sullivan Brown, because you're right, Giles, you usually speak about recruitment, but to me, leaver and starter feedback should be forming a key part of any recruitment strategy. It's so important, and the information that comes from that really feeds into candidate motivations and what we're seeing in our Sullivan Brown world about why people would be interested in a role and why they wouldn't. So it's all joined. So I am essentially a massive recruitment geek and employee experience geek when it comes to starter, leaver feedback and all of that jazz. That's me.
Great. And tell us a little bit more about MySay, because I think that will help frame this conversation quite nicely.
Yeah. So MySay grew out of Sullivan Brown. About 10 years ago, one of our HR director clients asked if they could borrow one of my team to do some exit interviews, and we'd never been asked that before. And really, it was the independence that they wanted. And from then on, we always had a MySay project on the go, but we could only do it over the phone. And therefore, we were very limited by how much of it we could do. and then lockdown happened. So we decided to develop MySay as a business. So where we are now is we have a team of interviewers, we have psychologists. So one of the partners in MySay is a qualified business psychologist and ex-global HR director, literally one of the most phenomenal HR people I know. And also, my husband, who's our CTO, who designed the whole system. So now we have an online survey tool so that we could scale the service. And we also do telephone interviews. So we're quite unique in that way, in that we can scale because we can do all of the interviews on a survey, but actually we do like to do some of them over the phone so that we can really get under the skin of what people are actually saying and how they're saying it. So we work with a large variety of clients across different sectors. Some clients use us because they have an attrition issue or an attraction issue, and they want to get under the skin of that. But actually, what's been really interesting to us is the amount of clients that use us because they're focusing on leaver advocacy, which is something that's, I think, needs to be a much bigger thing in the world of attraction and retention. You know, you might not keep people as long as you used to, but actually, what are you doing to send them off as advocates in your business? And, you know, are you relying on Glassdoor to understand that? Because don't make Glassdoor the only place they can go to talk about it, I would say. So leaver advocacy, massive thing of mine, hence the question about leaver NPS. So we've got companies that use us because actually they're focusing on leaver advocacy as a measure of success, rather than using exit interviews to just focus on retaining people and really tying themselves in knots, trying to improve levels of retention of service. But also we do stay interviews. So we've been working with clients who are using stay interviews to replace their engagement survey for a year or something like that. So they can really get under the skin actually of why people are staying as well. And because we're independent, we can ask the question, have you looked for another job in the last 6 months? Which a lot of people aren't going to say to their actual employer. So we've got online surveys, we've got interviews, we do thematic analysis, sentiment analysis, reporting, we do focus groups. So we're essentially an employee feedback, employee research business. And our biggest strength is the fact that we are not you. So our team is completely independent. The feedback is anonymous. People can speak to us in confidence. And it's great to be able to get that feedback for businesses. And I have a secret hope. In fact, it's not that secret, but I just have a hope that if more companies do this and take their leaver interviews seriously and see it as more than just an opportunity to stop someone leaving, get the timing of it right, get the method of it right, and really kind of get serious about it, then actually those Glassdoor reviews might just start fixing themselves. Because I'm starting to see products coming out now of companies that will go on and fix your Glassdoor reviews. To me, it just kind of really makes me want to cry, because you should be fixing that by really getting under the skin of what employees are experiencing and what colleagues are experiencing and what's driving their decision to join or leave you, rather than just having your online presence cleaned up, which upsets me, because I'm like, no, make it better for people.
Totally. I think if your only measure of your employee experience is your Glassdoor reviews, then it's kind of like stable door horse bolted type situation.
Yeah.
How can anybody fix a Glassdoor review without
the
organisation inherently changing the culture of the employee experience? That's crazy.
Yeah, no, apparently there's a lot of online cleaning up you can do, and companies are starting to make a living from that. But to me, that just, really makes my heart sink into my boots, because, I think in having been in recruitment for 27 years, I've seen shifts and changes in what drives candidate behaviour and what people expect from an employer. And COVID was a real kind of time bomb under all of that. And I don't think all the pieces have landed in exactly where we're at with that. What we do know is that people expect more from their employer, and decision makers saying, well, it wasn't like that in my day, or it wasn't like that in the 90s, really isn't going to cut it. It just has to change. People have different expectations, whatever generation you're from. This isn't necessarily for me a generational thing. There are people other than Gen Z and Gen Y and, that have expectations of their employer, and they should be met as well.
Yeah. Although, to be fair, those generations are demanding a lot more. So it's not so much what can I do for you, it's what are you going to do for me. So there is a bit of a shift in that for sure. So with that, and having us done intros and sort of set the scene, laid the foundations a little bit, where would you like to go next? Because I know that you've got some data to show. Do you want to start with that, Or
yeah, let's start there, and then hopefully that will drive some conversation. And if people want to ask anything, that's great. So the slides that I brought, I mean, I could have put a whole slide deck together and spoken to you for days, really, on this stuff. One, because I geek out on it, and two, because I think it's genuinely really quite interesting, and it's where a lot of businesses are focusing. So these are some benchmark stats from our system, from starter interviews and leaver interviews that have taken place over the last 18 months. And there are hundreds of these. So it's interesting data, and this is across different sectors, different types of people. We do surveys of people in clinical roles, in warehouse roles, in professional roles. So it's a really good mix. But what's interesting is I don't think we see actually that much change across roles and across location and across sector. Ultimately, people are people. And a lot of what we're seeing at the moment is that people want similar things, regardless of your role, regardless of your sector. So these are some overall stats. So the first thing you can see here is what we're seeing as the top 5 primary drivers of why somebody would join your organization. And these are the final trigger, if you like. This is the reason that you got them over the line. It probably isn't the reason that they were looking at you in the first place, but it's the reason that they decided to join. So it's their primary reason. And people choose one of these and say, yeah, this ultimately was the final thing. So we asked for primary and contributory drivers, and definitely going to show you those contributory drivers in a minute, and also the levers. So I think for us, this is interesting, and it's interesting for businesses for a number of different reasons. So I always think if you're going to take your lever interviews seriously, mirror them with your starter interviews, so that you are really understanding people's experience and you're seeing where there might be any red flags right from the start. So for example, if a lot of people are joining you for career progression and development, but they're leaving you because of lack of career progression and development, it tells you there's probably something going on with your messaging, depending on the length of service of those people that are leaving. Likewise, improved work-life balance. But I think what's interesting here is, I mean, first of all, the obvious thing for me is pay is not there. So, it isn't in the top 5 drivers about why the starters that we're interviewing are joining an organization. And actually, that's what we're seeing in our HR recruitment world as well. When we go into the world of recruitment, pay is not the main factor there either. It is a factor. It's not the main factor. But this kind of, 34.7% looking for career development and progression, to me, is a really interesting one, because I know that was mirrored in your stats as well, that you looked at. We see it in reasons for leaving. We'll come to those in a minute. So we see that too. But I think what's really interesting to me about it is that we've been doing lots of events and talks about human sustainability and the future of HR. And I think that's really what this comes to. When you get under the skin of the comments, which of course I can't do here because I can't share those comments, but when we start writing reports on this and people talk about career progression and development, I think it's really key to note that it isn't always about promotion and grades of progression. It's much more about, how are you going to help me grow as a person? How are you going to help me grow as an employee, even if it's not necessarily going to benefit you? So people, when you read under the skin of this, I think it's an interesting headline that career progression and development is the kind of top primary driver. But I think it would be a mistake for companies to really focus on the fact that actually this is because we're promoting everybody or we're offering people a promotion. This is about human growth. So how are you going to help me grow? There's some interesting things around human sustainability, around people don't expect a job for life, but they do expect lifetime employability. And people will be loyal to you, and you will have that engagement with them if you see that you are developing them, even if it's not necessarily going to improve the performance in the job that you are asking them to do. It's not about skills-based development necessarily, or job-based development. It's about development. And that to me is an interesting thing, because I think in all of the years that I've been doing recruitment, that is a relatively recent expectation of an employer. And this is where it comes to that human sustainability, and the future of HR is around employers adding value to employees, not just merely extracting it. And that, I think, is a fairly recent shift. But clearly, because of the stats we saw and the stats that you saw and the conversations that we have with colleagues, that's important. So, is that something that's happening in your organizations? Is it something that you are talking about? Is it something that people understand you're going to give them when they join you? And actually, is it something you're going to give them? Because it is important to people. So to me, that's a key takeaway from the primary drivers, because that's huge. That number, they only get to choose one option at that time. So for over a third to be choosing that, to me, that's really important. But then I think
it is massive, because remember we had, so when we do these sessions, I'll normally sort of plan out and have a chat and what have you ahead of it, and we looked at that one, and it's something that actually we discovered even within job train. It won't have the same hard metrics that you did, but we ran a culture survey. And what we had a slight concern, we had people that have been within the business for quite a long period of time, and it's like, can we promote them? And actually, in many cases, people didn't necessarily want promotion per se, but they just wanted to extend their skills, their experience, their learning. And that was really helpful to us in terms of understanding what different individuals' drivers were within job trainers and business, and also where they wanted to develop and how we could best support that. So it's a really important point, not to be misled or to be led to thinking that everybody wants promotion, because that's not always the case at all.
Not at all. And I think actually in a lot of ways that is good news for employers, because, one of the age-old challenges that companies have is we can't just keep promoting people. There is a limit to how many people we can have. And actually some of the interviews that we do, some of the companies we speak to, people talk about this culture is really top heavy because we've got a lot of long-serving people and they've just been promoted. And actually that can lead to dissatisfaction amongst people. So I think it's good news for employers, because it means that you can develop a learning culture in a different way, and you don't have to be constantly looking for how do we promote someone? I think what it does talk about is how do we grow people, and how do we make people feel that they are being invested in? And we once we've been through the slides, maybe we can talk more about some of the practical ways that we're seeing companies do this, and what we're seeing in real life is actually valued by people once we've been through those stats. So I don't think it comes as any surprise that improved work-life balance then comes second, because hybrid isn't going anywhere and it's still important to people. 15%. So interestingly, more people value development and progression over improved work-life balance, but that they're not, that they are linked. So, people aren't going to come for progression or development if you're not going to give them an element of flexibility either. And we'll talk about that more when we come to contributory drivers. But I think, these are important things to people, and people still want that improved work-life balance. A career change is an interesting one, because I think, there was a lot of talk about the great resignation post-COVID. To me, it wasn't necessarily a great resignation. It was a great realignment. I think it was a realignment of expectations and people really understanding what they wanted out of work. And that's led to this, I'm taking a career change because I want to try something different. But I also think that people talking about a career change is linked to that career progression and development, because people will take change to feel that they're going to get growth and that they're going to be challenged. So I don't think the two aren't linked. I think they're quite closely linked in terms of the feedback that we get. A good reputation as an employer, clearly, very important. And I think this is where, to me, advocacy is key, because if you don't take control of your own narrative as to what your leaver advocacy is saying, or your starter advocacy is saying, how are people really going to understand your reputation? It can't just be because of refer a friend schemes and things like that. It's much more complex than that. But recommended to me by an existing employee is there in the top 5. What's interesting again about that is that most of the clients that we work with do not have an official referral scheme. So this is where advocacy to me is key, in that if you're having to reward colleagues to be advocates for you, then you're not really working on your advocacy. To me, it's the wrong focus. So I'm not saying referral schemes aren't good, but I do think that if there's a monetary benefit to that referral, are people referring for the right reasons? And actually that kind of genuine advocacy of, I work in a great place and I would get one of my friends or family to work here, is the dream. That's the golden ticket. That's what you're aiming for. So yeah, those are the things that really jump out at me about these.
What I love about that, was really interesting, is if you ultimately those last two are connected, and you could almost combine them, which actually takes you to, well, I don't know, if 18-20% So if you combine those together, then that's actually the second most significant driver to people joining an organisation, and that kind of shines a light on the importance and the significance of employee experience and advocacy.
Beautiful. Well, I mean, I think the thing is, choosing to join an organization is not that much different from choosing to buy something. It's a purchasing decision. We go through the same processes, and it's often said people buy, you know, they buy with emotion and justify with logic, and you know, we do that, or we'd never have no one buy design or anything, for example, because, you know, a Primark handbag, I use this analogy all the time, carries things in exactly the same way as a Mulberry handbag. News flash. And it's a lot cheaper, but we attach emotion to things. And I think, you know, when we're going through a purchasing decision, we look for reinforcement that we're making the right decision. And that might be Amazon reviews, or, you know, online reviews, or it might be just asking somebody, you know, where did you get your car from? Was the service good? Did they treat you well? Has the after service been great? And we really, if we're speaking to someone we trust, we take that feedback seriously, and we ask, and we justify that decision to ourselves. Joining a business is no different. It's a really, really big decision. And if someone recommends who we trust, then we are more likely to accept that role or apply for a job with that company. It's no different to me referring you as an applicant tracking system, which I do often because you're great and I've implemented you and you do a great job. So I feel happy that I can recommend you to my network because I know that you're not going to make me look silly and then treat them really badly and then come back to me and go, what were you thinking? I know you're not going to do that. And so I think it's the same thing, isn't it? It's about that trust. And if someone you know recommend someone and you trust that person, you're more likely to join them as an employer. Likewise, if, you know, and people do use Glassdoor, if you go on Glassdoor and see positive things, you're more likely to join them as an employer. I think the good thing about leaver feedback and starter feedback is you can control that whole narrative, and you can genuinely understand how people are experiencing those experiences within your business, and you can use that to then share that with people who you might be wanting to bring into your business.
Brilliant.
So if you move on to the
words.
You what, sorry?
Thank you for your kind words. You got me blushing a bit. It takes a lot to do that. So thank you.
And I think then if you move on to the contributory drivers, so when we're surveying people, we ask for primary and we ask for contributory, and the difference is that with a primary driver, it's kind of that final trigger. So we often see them, especially with levers, as being pull factors. So things that you do to either pull someone towards you, or things that other companies did to pull them out of your business. The contributory drivers, so with primary drivers for starters and levers, we tend to see them being more pull. With contributory drivers, people can choose as many of these options as they like. And this is where we start to see how complex a decision it is to join or leave a business, because people will often choose 4 or 5 or 6 contributory factors. And we see those being more push factors. So the things that your company can do to really influence that outcome about whether they join or leave. So what you can see here is that in the contributory, people, first of all, they're much closer. And if we were to show you every reason, you'd see it's a really long list, actually. But, you know, we only have an hour. So this is the top 5. So this is where you see pay come in. So we can see it's the second highest contributory driver. Now, we tend to see this a little bit with levers as well, because of course pay is going to form part of any decision that you make when you're joining or leaving a business. You still have to survive. You have to pay your bills. But we rarely see it in the top drivers. It's rarely that kind of final trigger. It's usually part of the contributory decision making. But, you know, it's a really complex decision that people are making, and it's formed from lots of different factors that they are considering when they're thinking about whether they want to join or leave your business. So this is where we start to see the pay and the benefits coming in. We still see career progression and development. We still see improved work-life balance, and we still see good reputation as an employer. So they're not really surprises, but you can see that people are the way that I think about it is people are considering the deal. So when people join your business as an employer, you expect something from them. You expect them to come in and do a good job from you, but they also expect things from you. And those expectations have got far more complex and are getting far more complex. As you said, as new generations come through, but also post-COVID, people expect more. So you're seeing this kind of variety. We expect you to have a good reputation. We also expect you to pay as well. And also we want benefits. And interestingly, that benefits question is quite broad. So, you know, it isn't cycle to work scheme and things like that. It just isn't. It isn't fruit and it isn't a pool table. Those benefits will often be linked to hybrid and flexibility. Or to be honest, we see more people asking about pension. The biggest one, the biggest draw that I jump up and down about as a recruiter, if I get something good in this area, is holidays. People want holidays, they want time. And I think this is why improved work-life balance is also in there. You know, we see people wanting time, and do those benefits, interestingly, I think this is an interesting point as well. How do those benefits make me feel? Do they make me feel valued? So the benefits are not, I think, what we used to typically see as benefits. No one asks me really, you know, do they have a cycle to work scheme? What do I get to claim expenses for? No one really asks about a car anymore either, but they will want to know about the holidays. They will want to know about the pension. And people will make a judgment about the quality of that employer and the experience they're going to give based on how well they feel those benefits indicate that a company values their colleagues. So this is the thing, I think, with data is interesting in that it shows you something, but actually it's the comments that come out underneath, which is why we like to do some of these on the phone, that really help us understand what people mean when they say better benefits or improve work-life balance or career progression and development. And I think it's more complex, you know, than it ever has been.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Right.
So if you want to look at what leavers are saying, and I think this interesting as well, and I love it. We work with a lot of companies where we do starters and leavers. So this graph is taken from, this is actually what a client would see on their dashboard. So that a customer would see on their dashboard. So they would see their leavers and starters side by side and could immediately recognize if there are any red flags. So what you can see here is the top primary driver is other, which is really annoying from a data perspective. But I think it shows that actually this is often quite a personal decision. So we give people a lot of options to choose from, but there are still things there that are very personal to people. So what I would say about that is 18% said other. When you break down that feedback, there's no obvious theme to that. Absolutely no obvious theme. Because if you think about it, it could be, I fell in love with someone that lives 200 miles away. Could be anything, but also we do have some involuntary leavers in there. So some of our clients do survey their involuntary leavers. So, you know, other might be, I was made redundant. So it does skew a little bit. But I think the reason other often comes out at the top is just it's a really personal thing to me. So it's nothing to do with anybody else, but, you know. But what we see outside of that is better career opportunities again at 10%. Pay is in there at 8%. Personal reasons. So even, you know, even other doesn't include a lot of the personal reasons. It's really interesting when you actually start looking at what people are saying. And then improved work-life balance is still in there as well. But I think what you see here is that there's no one big thing. So primary drivers are interesting in that, again, they tend to be that thing that tips someone over the edge, which is why you see pay in there or better career opportunities. But they're not really always going to give you the answers as to why people are leaving. It's really understanding what people are saying behind these comments that bring it to life, I think. And again, they tend to be a pull factor. The primary drivers will tend to be a pull factor. And, you know, other can include things like ill health, or just anything that could be quite personal. I can see Gary's question there. Is it because of bad management? It's not. It's not. Sorry, I can only see that it's K. So I don't know, but it isn't. It does come out. Interestingly, bad management is a really, really interesting one. So this is where I start to really geek out. So before COVID, when we used to, the way our surveys work is we have sections for every area of employee experience, and my manager is one of those sections. And pre-COVID, we would ask people, and when I came to write the reports or read the comments about my manager, it was kind of like, okay, I'm going to walk away, I'm going to get some Haribo and a coffee, and I'm just going to take a minute and get my hard hat on, because this is going to be a lot of really emotive feedback that can be quite difficult to read. And that was quite consistent across any company we spoke to. People were really quite emotive about how their manager treated them. What happened during COVID, and we haven't seen it totally flip back, is that people are quite empathetic towards their managers. So during COVID, it was like managers realigned with their teams because they were in it together. And also the cost of living crisis has meant that a lot of managers don't feel particularly well rewarded for what they're doing, and expectations of managers has grown significantly. And we've seen a lot of that negativity that was usually reserved for managers shift upwards to leadership. And what we'll see is people saying the leaders are disconnected, the leaders aren't visible, I don't understand the purpose of what the leaders are saying. It doesn't actually resonate with me. The leaders aren't very nice to my manager. They make my manager's life really difficult. So I know my manager would like to be more like this for me, but they don't have time because of the expectations put on them by leadership. And so it has changed. So what we find is that actually people are very honest with us anonymously. Told you I struggled with that word. They're really quite honest, but a lot of their feedback goes elsewhere. What we do see across our surveys is that L&D often comes in as the lowest scoring area. And one of the reasons we see for that, though, is not necessarily L&D as we know it. One, it's down to the career opportunities and development question that, came up in the starter surveys, but a lot of it is down to one-to-ones and coaching. So where we see consistent feedback across the board about managers, it tends to be they don't have time to sit down and give me feedback, or I don't get my one-to-ones. And people are really crying out for that because it feeds into that personal growth and development. So that's one area that we see consistently people actually talking about their managers, but they don't always place the blame at their door. When people talk about their managers negatively or positively, interestingly, what we see is when people talk about their managers positively, it tends to be quite personal. My manager's great. They care about me. They support me. They value me. They're always listening to what I want to say. And we see the absolute opposite where people talk negatively about their managers. It's, I feel unsupported. I don't feel heard. I don't feel like I don't feel valued. And these are consistent. So I think there is actually an option in here to choose my manager as a reason for leaving, and we never see it in the top categories, but people will then talk to us quite openly about it. I think there's been a shift of expectation about what people see from their managers, and I also think there's been increased expectations put on managers, so that level of feedback has gone up to leadership. I hope that makes sense. And
yeah, it does. Perhaps we'll come on to talk about culture, because if we're shifting that if like the blame or the reason for somebody leaving up beyond management to leadership, then we're talking about culture.
Yes. Yeah.
Pretty great then. So anyway, we'll come on to talk about that. Yeah. So what about the contributory drivers?
Yeah. So again, when you move on to the contributory, you'll see that other is still up there. But again, you can see, the top answer there has 9% outside of other. And other, I think when people are leaving a business, they are feeling something. And I think this is why we see other really come to the top in both of these, because we see more sentiment in leaver interviews. And a lot of people have made a decision to leave because of how these factors have made them feel as a human being. So that's what really drives someone then to start to disengage and look for other work or be open to an approach from another employer. So other is still up there. Better pay is there. Again, you would expect it to be, because people can choose as many factors as they like as contributory drivers. Everyone's going to consider pay. So again, I think this is one of the things with data. It's up there as the second top reason. It doesn't mean that people are leaving you because of pay. It means I consider pay as part of my decision. But improved work-life balance is in there again, better career opportunities. Now, interestingly, though, you can see not satisfied with the working environment. And I think this is because with contributory drivers, we see more push factors. So this is always going to be where you start to see my manager are not satisfied with the working environment. And of course, working environment will include management, just to answer that, to refer to the question previously, but it will include a whole mix of factors. And to your point, Giles, it will start to be fed into by culture, because the working environment usually, in terms of the feedback when you speak to people, doesn't mean my desk, the parking. the toilets. It doesn't mean the physical working environment. It can, but usually what it means is the feel of the environment that I'm going into, that kind of intangible work environment culture, but not necessarily that whole overall culture of the organization. So this is where you start to see those things feeding in. And certainly when people give us comments, a lot of the feedback is around that. It's about the leadership, the culture they drive, the work environment, how I'm finding that. And I think this is, I was doing a demo of MySafe for a company yesterday, and I loved what they had to say, because this is how we feel about it. A lot of companies view leaver interviews as just trying to understand why that person left, or see it as an opportunity to stop that person leaving. But actually, to me, if you're doing engagement surveys and pulse surveys, there's only so many times you can do that. There's only so many times you can ask people questions throughout the year and get good feedback. There's only so many times you can do an engagement survey. What I love about starter and leaver feedback is it's continuous feedback. So, because you're asking people as they join and as they leave, so it's continuous. So you can start to see the shifts and trends in what people are saying. And because our surveys, if you see them, they're really quite long, and they very much mirror an engagement survey. So what we're doing with leavers is understanding what their whole employee experience has been like. And with starters, what their whole kind of starter experience and employee experience has been like to this point. We tend to do it about 3 months in. So it gives you much more information about what's happening in your organization than beyond why somebody started with you and why someone's leaving. And I think that's often a mistake that companies make, is you look at it as very narrow, but actually it can be a really good barometer of ongoing employee experience in your organization without sending out constant pulse surveys for the people that are still there. Because the danger of doing that is you get to a point where people are saying, please stop asking me because I don't see things changing as a result. So, you've got to be careful with that, and this can give you a good balance. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent again because
not at all. Not at all.
I'm a total geek with this stuff.
That's great. Laura, thanks for the slides. I think that's it now, isn't it, in terms of the slides going through. So that's brilliant. In the lead up to this session, I said, do you want to run a poll and things? And you suggested asking the audience today about NPS scores, Net Promoter Scores. Do you want to, some people may not be familiar with Net Promoter Scores. Do you want to explain for everybody here what that is and the potential value of it?
Yeah. Well, I imagine that most people are familiar with employee NPS, which is pretty much a standard measure in your employee engagement surveys. And essentially, it measures levels of advocacy amongst your colleagues. So it will generally be driven by a question, how likely are you to recommend us as a good employer? And that tends to be the standard question that people will ask to measure that. So eNPS tends to be a really standard measure that most companies will know. If you're not doing that, that would be quite unusual. I think most companies are. I mean, I don't know, but
well, this is the thing. So we've only had 6 responses. If anybody else wants to jump in, you'll find the poll just on the right hand side. But 80% of the people that did respond have said no, they don't.
But that's not a surprise to me, because eNPS is pretty standard. So most companies will be measuring their employee net promoter score. It's a standard output of an engagement survey, and most companies now do some kind of engagement survey. Interestingly, they didn't when I started in HR recruitment, and now it's like, what? You don't do an engagement survey? That's where we want to get leaver and starter surveys too, because we think actually the feedback from those is very, very rich, because you're never quite as focused on how you're viewing your employer as when you're thinking of joining or leaving them. So we think actually that's really valuable. So we want to get that there. What we do with so when we're doing stay interviews, we also calculate eNPS, and we'll tell companies what their eNPS is from stay interviews. And one of the things you might want to ask at some point is, what's the difference between a stay and an engagement? Because we talk about that a lot as well. But with starter and leaver, we do starter NPS and leaver NPS. So your starter net promoter score and your leaver net promoter score. And we ask specifically about leaver net promoter score, and it does not surprise me that 80% don't. I think it's very difficult to get benchmark data on leaver NPS. Most companies don't do it. And I think the reason that a lot of companies don't do it is because it's difficult to do. it's hard to get people to be honest with you when you work in that business. If you're their manager, you're definitely not independent. If you're HR, you're not independent. Now, I love HR people. My world depends on them. And I love HR for all kinds of reasons. I wouldn't have a business without HR people. And I'm genuinely passionate about the sector, having worked in it so long. But the reality is HR people are not independent. And a lot of businesses do their exit interviews when somebody is still in the business. So they come and they do that exit interview, and then they have to go and sit with their manager or sit with their colleagues or sit in the environment that they've just been negative about. So it's really difficult to get honest feedback. And even if you get it, it tends to come in the form of a Word document where lots of notes have been made. It's put on someone's file. How do you then turn it into something insightful and something actionable? Well, that's what we do. So leave NPS to us. What I would love in a couple of years' time is that people are using their Lever NPS that we've got for them to promote themselves as an employer. So where it's really useful is, and I'll name check them. If you go on our website, there's a blog about this. They're great. There's a company called Opencast that we work with. They have very few levers, actually, because they are a great employer. But they're in the tech sector, and they know, they are realistic, that people will only stay for a certain amount of time because they want to go and work on new tech. They don't want to stay working on the same tech for their whole career. So they make themselves a brilliant employer, but they know that they are going to lose people. So what they are focusing on, and in their measures of success as a HR team in a business, is they are aiming to get their Lever NPS close to their eNPS. Now, we know from working with lots of different companies, because we're now building benchmark data on this, that if your Lever NPS is somewhere between -20 and 0, you're doing all right. These people have chosen to leave you. They're going to have some negative things to say. So you're doing all right if it's between -20 and 0. If you're in the positives, you're doing really well. You are winning at advocacy. If your Lever NPS is anywhere near your eNPS, you have got the golden ticket. You are absolutely acing this, and your people are going out and saying, you got to go work there. I've just come out of there. I've left for this reason, but seriously, guys, you got to go and work there. That's kind of a dream.
Right.
It's a dream from a recruitment point of view, but it's also a dream because you know that you're getting something right for your colleagues, and they are doing some brilliant stuff to do that. So I think Lever NPS should be a really clear marker. Instead of people having to go to Glassdoor to read what it's like to work for you, they should be able to see what your levers are saying. How do your levers score you? And if they're scoring you in this way, and they're saying this about you, and they're saying this is where you're strong, that's really powerful. In the same way from your starters. So we do starter NPS, and it will tell you, how are these people who've been with you about 3 months? Are they advocates for your business? Because if they're not, you've got an issue, and if they are, why aren't you shouting about it? So I think this comes to, again, in that future of HR space, in this new world of work, we need to be looking at new measures to see how successful we're being with our people strategy and as an employer. And I think these are new measures that really say something about an organization, and yet they're used so infrequently, and so few companies actually monitor them, which is why we're building the benchmark data, because you can't really find anything out there.
Definitely. So I'd like to talk about staying teams. We've got a couple of questions before we get there. One from Richard. Can you just clarify again the difference between a primary driver and a contributor driver?
Yes. So with primary drivers, when we ask the question, so I'll try and do it from the way that we ask the question. So when we go through our surveys, we ask, what was your primary driver for joining, or what was your primary driver for leaving? And they are the trigger. It's like if you've been unhappy in work for, say, 6 months, and then somebody offers you something and you just can't say no to it. It's that trigger. It's the final thing that made you decide to join or leave. So it tends to be a pull. With levers, it tends to be a pull factor. So you might leave and join my business because I'm paying you more, although that's rarely the top pull factor, I've got to say. Or it might be because your culture has stood out to me, or it might be because you're offering me more holidays, or it might be because you're closer to where I live and I want to spend more time with my kids. It could be anything, but it tends to be a pull. It's about that company. So again, a good example of this is free advert here for Greggs, but I'm a huge fan of Greggs as a business. I've interviewed the chief exec, who was their chief people officer. She's phenomenal. They have an amazing people culture. They're advertising at the moment for a head of people. That will be a pull factor for people. That will pull people who are not unhappy where they are now, because it's Greggs and because they do brilliant things in the people space. So that's a pull factor. With push factors, they are the things that your organization is doing to essentially push people out of the door. So they are the things in your control. So if my head of people is applying for that Greg's role at the moment, I can't do anything about that. They do have an amazing people brand. They're an amazing business. People are going to apply for them. There's nothing I can do. But if I am driving people out of the door with my push factors, i.e. my culture isn't right, the remuneration isn't right, or the recognition isn't right, tends to be a big one, or I'm not making people feel valued or supported or heard, those are my push factors. They are things that I can influence that will stop people leaving my business if I get those right.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
And from Hannah, is it fair to say that sometimes culture will not change and taking the learnings from leavers to attain the right people is most important?
Oh, that's a massive question, isn't it? I think so. Well, yeah, it is fair to say that, because changing culture is not an overnight job. So if what you're hearing from the feedback is that culture is an issue, you can't fix that overnight. I don't know whether I agree that taking the learns from leavers to attain the right people is most important. I think it's understanding to what degree you can fix the things that are coming out as the main themes as to why people are leaving. So culture is a big thing. So I would say, rather than trying to take the lens to retain the right people is the most important, I would say getting the messages about culture to the right people in the organization that can help you change it is the most important. I think that's a difficult question, because you'd have to understand who the right people are and why are they the right people, and are they the right people in the culture that you're aiming towards. So I think some of the stuff you're talking about there about retaining the right people probably sits more nicely with stay interviews than it does with exit and leaver. Exit and leaver will show you where you've got a problem. And then I think the job of the HR leaders, and some of our customers find this easier in some businesses than others, is to get that message about culture to the right people and then understand how you're going to do it. And also understanding what sits under it. So culture is so broad. So, if people say the culture isn't right, then that's where the telephone interviews are good, because we can probe and say, well, what do you mean by that? What is it about the culture? What would make you feel that there'd been a shift or a change in that? I hope that answers. That's a big one.
Yeah, that's a nice little segue, actually, because I'm conscious of time and I want to give enough space and opportunity to talk about stay interviews, because everybody's probably might be familiar with recording some kind of sentiment at the point which people join, how was the recruitment experience, what drove you to join our organisation, and equally exit interviews. But stay interviews is something that people may not be so familiar with. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, what we can learn, and also how best to action the data and insight you get from stay interview?
Yeah. So I think stay interviews are nice because, done well, they can get really in-depth insight into how people are feeling that are in your organization at the moment. And we see companies using them in different ways. So we see some of our customers that we've worked with are using them to focus on particular areas. So when you're talking about the right people there, Hannah, I don't fully know what you mean by that. But for example, we've worked with one customer who, they have a group of people that they simply cannot deliver their service without. They just can't. So if they lose these people, they're done. Like they can't do it. So recruiting those people is really hard, and making sure those people feel valued is important. So we've done a project to do stay interviews with them, which were a much more in-depth conversation about how you feel about working in that organization at that time, but directly intent to stay. And intent to stay is something that's really difficult to gauge as an employer, because you are hoping that people are going to be really honest with you. So we will ask the question, have you looked for a new job in the last 6 months? What made you look for that job in the last 6 months? Did you actively go through any other recruitment processes? What attracted you to that recruitment process? What could we do to change that for you? We ask those questions, and they're really, it's a really personal question. Have you looked for a new job in the last 6 months? But it's such valuable information. But we also ask them what they value most about working in an organization and what frustrates them most about working in an organization. So it's really direct questioning, but in a nice way. People really do share with us. But it shows you if you've got an issue in one area of the business, it gives you an opportunity to really get under the skin of that. So you can use it in that way. one of our recent projects was actually a smaller business who uses a large engagement survey provider. And they decided that they've been doing that engagement survey for a couple of years. They get information, but it leaves them still with some questions. So they follow up on the information that they get, but it still isn't necessarily hitting the mark. There's still something they're not getting. So they decided not to run their engagement survey this year, but for us to do stay interviews with everybody in the business. And we had 92% take up on that.
Wow.
But it gave some really straight feedback about what people are experiencing in that business that perhaps a bigger engagement survey just couldn't quite get to. And actually, the real difference, I think, with that one is that it wasn't even necessarily what people were saying, although that was really valuable. It was how they felt about speaking to us and how hard we had to work to really reassure them about the confidentiality and the anonymity about what we were doing, because they were scared. But we still got 92% response rate and people still spoke to us, but it was really that reassurance about confidentiality that got it. And I don't think they would have got that feedback from just doing their engagement survey again. So what stay interviews are is a really nice kind of flexible tool that you can either use across your whole business or in pockets where you think, we've got an issue here, let's try something different to really get under the skin of that.
Yeah, I guess if you found that people were a little bit scared about engaging in or speaking openly within a stay interview, then that in itself probably tells you something about the culture. And I would have expected that actually just by conducting a stay interview shows how much you value how your people are feeling about their experience, and actually people will probably embrace that and see that as a real positive.
Yeah. And we often get people saying to us, I'm so glad I've been given this opportunity to speak to somebody independent. And I'm so glad I had that chance to do that. I've got it off my chest and I feel better. And I like to think that's one bad Glassdoor review knocked off at the source. That's what I like to think. But I also think you're absolutely right, Giles. I mean, we gain insight just from the way colleagues are with us. And whenever we do a project with a client or we start working with a customer, it's often very different depending on how people speak to us. So, I mean, we had one where we did a project where it was fair to say that we had trouble getting people to take part initially, and the language that we got was quite choice. And what was interesting about that one was people weren't even just they weren't just ghosting us, they were actually ringing us to tell us to go away in no uncertain terms and some choice language.
Wow.
But even that was useful insight to the customer. This is how people feel, that's unusual. And because we do this with lots of different companies, when we get one that's an outlier and we get something like that that's a real indicator of culture, or the example that the first example that I gave you about the fear, and that's an indicator of culture, that is interesting to the customer in its own right, kind of how people speak to us and how they are, how fearful they are or how angry they are. That's hard to quantify, but it's useful.
So if you have situations like that, I mean, obviously that's quite extreme. In your experience, and I'm assuming that when MySafe has been brought in, that is a senior leadership decision, or at least HR.
It's often a senior HR decision, actually. I think senior leadership often needs some convincing, because a lot of MDs, they will say, can't we just do that ourselves? Let's just do it ourselves.
Yeah. But armed with that insight and that data, how receptive have you found leadership to be in recognizing that there are things or areas that could be improved or problems that need to be solved?
Yeah, mixed, Giles, I would say, really mixed. So in some cases, and different outcomes. So in some cases, we find that HR are pushing against a really difficult door to open, because they've got this feedback and it's hard for people to hear, or leaders just don't believe it. But I have to say that in every case, we've always managed to get them there, but they just sometimes take a little bit longer. What is interesting sometimes is that HR know that this is a useful thing to do. So they come and they engage with us, but it even takes them maybe 3 to 6 months to really fully understand how they're going to use the insight, because there aren't many companies that are doing starter and leaver interviews well. There are even fewer that are doing stay interviews. So even people, though, recognize that even though they recognize the value, sometimes they go, okay, well, that's great, but this is all new to us. We've never had this before. We've never had this insight, and it's taken us some time to really get used to having it and how we use it. So it can often be 6 months into a kind of 12-month agreement with a client that they suddenly start to go, oh my God, this is amazing. We don't know how we managed without this before.
Yeah.
Because it's new, and it's a new kind of dashboard to build into a routine and a new process. So I think it varies. But then we've had others that just totally get it. I mean, one of our clients just the other week was saying that they're doing us a case study, and they were saying that something came out in those stay interviews, and they're a CQC regulated business, and they said something came out in those stay interviews that they immediately got on top of and changed, and then they had an unexpected CQC inspection, and without that change, it would have been quite a different set of feedback from CQC. It was game changing for them. Wow. So it varies, I think, depending on the leadership, but often HR are hoping that this feedback is going to influence the leadership, but it does take time, just as in culture change does, but having that business case to take to them and having the data to take to them and the insight to actually put something behind often what HR knew all along is key to that success, I think.
Totally. I mean, ultimately, culture exists when there is a culture in every business, whether you realize it or not. It's living and breathing, totally. But ultimately, leadership do have a lot of influence in terms of addressing cultural issues, not just dictating. No leadership can really dictate what the culture is in the business, but through leadership themselves, you can obviously demonstrate, what a good culture should look like and what have you. Conscious time, we've got 5 minutes left. We could carry on chatting in the morning, but got a question from Maddie. Maddie says, significant number of strategies across different organizations indicate that attracting the best talent is an area of focus. Is there any data that you see that supports better succession planning to grow more internal human resources than bringing in external? I'm interested as the impact on current employee groups may feel less valued by these types of initiatives. Great point.
Yeah. So again, it's a really big question. So in terms of data, I would have to say there will be, but I don't have it to hand. What we do see is that when people feel that internal opportunities are not being offered to people internally and people are just being brought in from external, we see that come out in leaver surveys quite regularly. But again, it's usually down to not being valued, and you've written valued there. So valued, not valued is probably the most common sentiment that we see in either a positive or negative context throughout the processes. As a recruiter, and having worked in in-house recruitment as well, I know that better succession planning is something that companies really struggle with. I think it comes from being able to reframe what we think of as development, learning and development, and career development, and into those broader talent roles, like you alluded to at the beginning, Giles, where people, we don't always see the connect between recruitment teams and learning and development teams and HR teams. And we see that in the feedback that we get. And I see it in my HR world as well. So I think the key, not necessarily the data, is to have more people who are involved in broader talent roles, so that you're looking at, it's not just even succession planning, it's early careers, it's the entry requirements to hire, it's the whole thing really, I think, that needs to be identified. And we do a lot of workshops on inclusive recruitment around that. So I think it's definitely something that we see in terms of the feedback. There would be themes in our surveys that would back that up, I think, that I don't have to hand at the moment in terms of the numbers that comes out in the comments. Doesn't necessarily always come out in the data specifically to that, but it comes out in the data in terms of the development and the kind of internal recruitment processes as people would see it, and they would score against that. So we often see people scoring the external recruitment processes really highly, but the internal recruitment process is not so much, because they don't feel that necessarily promotes fairness and opportunity. Really sorry, that's a long question, and I don't know whether I've quite answered it for you. I think the thing is, one thing I would say is that with the surveys, when we build surveys for clients, we have core surveys, but people can add questions. So that would be something that perhaps people would want to put in as an actual question to see how people are necessarily feeling about that and those resources. But it does play into that subject of human sustainability and being able to develop people and give people employability for life. I think that all plays into that.
Totally. I feel like we've covered a lot. But I almost feel like we still need to cover culture and employee advocacy. I don't know if that's something we need to cover on a separate session. With 2 minutes left, we just wouldn't do it justice if we dug into it now. So maybe that's an invitation for a separate session on culture and employee advocacy. But I mean, Mo, thanks so much for your time this morning. It's been really, really interesting.
Thanks for having me.
If anybody wants the data from all the deck, there is actually a little link just below our faces here. So you can just click on that and grab hold of the data. But just, yeah, thank you for your time. And thank you to everybody that's joined us for this morning's session. We really hope you found it valuable. I will get into trouble if I don't mention our next session, which is on Tuesday. So that's a slight difference. We normally do this on Wednesday, but Tuesday, the 8th of October at 11 a.m. And this is, we're looking, funnily enough, at inclusive hiring. So breaking down barriers and looking at displaced workforce and how best to engage them as part of an inclusive hiring strategy. So I'm going to stick that link if you want to join that session. Be amazing. Thank you, Alex, has put that in there. I hope you have a really good rest of the week, and thank you so much for your time, your input, your questions, and we will see you all again soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.